Dr. Roy, could you pick that up? I mean, the president accepting some reality about the convention, but it seems to be in direct contradiction to the campaign that is ongoing and was supposed to be the substance of that press conference yesterday, that schools must reopen.
Yeah, so I guess it's good news in that he reached an enlightenment in so far as mass gatherings such as conventions and rallies are actually considered a health hazard because it increases the risk of transmission of the virus. So that is good news. But it's partial truth to say that the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, fully supports school reopening, because if you actually read the press release that was sent out by the statement that was released by the AAP a couple of weeks ago, they said, yes, schools are, of course, important for children. However, it must be done. Reopening must be done safely, in a way that's safe for all students, teachers, and staff. And science must drive the decision-making behind reopening. That was the official statement by the AAP, and I believe the president left that part out.
I'm sure he did. He also left his mask off last night when he headed to a Little League event. So it sounds like he's getting his pandemic advice from Betsy DeVos, not Anthony Fauci, who I see you are there trying to. His scientific brilliance is undisputed on this program, but we may have to debate his pitching acumen later, Dr. Roy. Heilman, let me come to you on where this leaves the president. In defiance of science, accepting some semblance of reality, I suppose, around bringing people to Florida for whatever he was going to peel off from the official business in North Carolina. But I refuse to accept that any reality about the pandemic itself, how it spreads, and that it's still spreading has set in for him to stand there. And even in light of Peter Baker's reporting that his own son's school isn't reopening, bully all the rest of the public schools in America to open.
Right. Nicole, I just want to correct one thing you just said. Hey, it's good to see you, by the way. First of all, hi, happy Friday.
Hi, happy Friday.
I don't think there's a lot. I don't think. Unfortunately, I worship the ground that Anthony Fauci walks on, but I'm afraid there's really no debate about his pitching skills. Unfortunately, it turns out the man, like all of us, has a flaw. And unlike your old boss, George W. Bush, who threw a dart after 9/11, Fauci looked a little bit more like Barack Obama. You remember throwing that big lollipop back when he tried to throw out the first pitch. So, you can't be great at everything. Nicole, I think that the distinction you're drawing is the important distinction. And my sense of it, talking to people around the Trump campaign, a number of things are true. One of which is that as Brad Parscale got demoted and so on, there's that the president is casting about to a wider circle of advisors now, people who worked on the previous campaign. He's trying to listen to more people right now because he recognizes the depth of his political difficulties, number one. Number two, a lot of those people are saying to him that that he must change one thing to make his political fortunes improve, and that is his approval rating on the coronavirus, a thing that back in March it was right around 50%, 51%. And then now it's down in the low 30s. And that if there's any chance for this race to be competitive, Donald Trump needs to bring his approval rating on the coronavirus up into the mid 40s at least. And so the question is how to do that. And I think one of the things you're right. I think his perception of the pandemic itself remains as primitive and misguided as ever. But the decision to shut down the convention is part of, I think, a strategy that recognizes that he has to try to rehabilitate himself and be seen by more of the public as having some clue, some plan, some concession to reality. The White House briefings, are him getting up on the briefing stage, is part of this, the attempt to be a little bit more disciplined in delivering those messages. And I think that the other thing that's happened, it's the last thing I'll say, is all of a sudden the people around Donald Trump realize that time is very short and that the election is not November 3rd. Well, the election day is November 3rd. The election starts in 6 weeks. We start voting in 6 weeks.
Right.
And given the number of people who are going to vote absentee and by mail, this election could be decided by the middle of October. The election could be decided before the first, depending on when the debates happen, before the final debate has happened. And so they have a very narrow window to try to put Donald Trump back in a place where he can even be competitive with Joe Biden. That is the reality right now. It's not that, like, can he win? It's, can he do enough in this next month or so to get himself in a place where he could even have a fight with Joe Biden? That's how bad his political standing is. And it's something that I think for the first time ever, the people around the president in the political sphere are willing to at least countenance that it's that bad.
Let me read you something, John Heilemann, from the brilliant Susan Glasser. She writes, she interviewed John Kasich, someone you and I have both interviewed, who has a good feel for his state, for Ohio, and for sort of that, not just the never Trump Republicans, but the on the fence Republicans, too. Glasser writes this: what I found most interesting in my conversation with Kasich was his sense that perhaps the country was finally done with the madness, the rage and division and exhaustion that might even be reshaping the presidential politics in Kasich's home state of Ohio, which Trump won by 8 points last time around. Trump's recent screw-ups have hit Americans directly and personally. Kasich pointed out to me coronavirus is a personal issue, as is the economy, as is race, and when you strike out on all three, then it becomes a tipping point. I think people have had enough. I do. Do you, John Heilemann, think this is over?
Well, I don't think anything's ever over, Nicole, because things go, there's so much, there's a lot, there's, I just said the time was short, and at the same time, there's a lot of things that can happen. I do think that, all we can do is read where we are today. And I think that if you look at the collection of data that we have, this is not, people say, well, in 2016, the polls are wrong. In 2016, the polls were a little bit wrong in some very important ways. There was never a moment in 2016 when Hillary Clinton led outside the margin of error in every battleground state. Never, not once, ever. There was never a moment that Hillary Clinton got to 50% in the national polling. There was never a moment when voters who disliked both candidates preferred Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump. There was a large segment, millions of voters who did not like either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, and they broke dramatically for Donald Trump. In this race, there are still millions of people who don't like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, but they're almost all breaking, overwhelmingly breaking for Joe Biden. The depth of data right now that suggests that this race, if the race happened today, if we had an election day tomorrow, it's not tomorrow, but if we held the election tomorrow in America, Joe Biden would win. He would not win narrowly. He would win overwhelmingly, both in the popular vote and the Electoral College. And I think if you get the people around Donald Trump who are not in total denial, the ones who who are looking at their own data, they would acknowledge to you that if the election were held tomorrow or next week, that Joe Biden would win 375 electoral votes. That's how bad the situation is. Nothing's over, though, because, we've seen that in America in 2020, pretty much anything can happen. Pretty much everything has happened. And I'm not willing to write off the possibility of more black swan game-changing events between now and November. It's crazy to think that anything is settled.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.